is accused of coercing 3 young men into relationships. Steve Osunsami has details of the lawsuits.
Behind the iron gates of a Georgia estate worth $1.4 million, a secret was buried for years inside the walls of a man who once filled stadiums in the name of God. The fortress belonged to Bishop Eddie Long, the preacher who paddled grown men into obedience. And what came tumbling out after his death made even the loyal members of his church question everything they ever believed. The federal lien that exposed everything. Let me tell you something that still feels surreal when you say it out loud. Months after Bishop Eddie Long was buried in an off-white robe with a gold cross resting on his chest, a federal document landed inside the DeKalb County Courthouse that nobody in his congregation was ready to read. The Internal Revenue Service had filed a lien against the late bishop and his widow Vanessa for $335,216. The document stated that there was a lien in favor of the United States on all property and rights to property belonging to the taxpayer. This was the same bishop who drove a Bentley off the lot of his Lithonia mansion while reporters chased him down for answers. And now, the very government he once partnered with under the Bush administration was knocking on his widow's door, asking for money he no longer had. New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, the kingdom Eddie Long built from 300 members into a claimed 25,000, was reportedly carrying a debt of $31 million by the time his successor took the pulpit. The membership had quietly shrunk to roughly 10,000. The fortress on Hunt Valley Drive was still standing, still gated, still grand, but the empire it represented was hollowed out from the inside. Have you ever noticed how the things people show off the loudest are usually the things they need to protect a lie? That mansion was the loudest thing Eddie Long ever owned, and what was hidden inside the paperwork of it would unravel a doctrine that millions of people had trusted with their souls. The boy who could not please his father. Long before the cathedral, the Bentley, and the federal lien, there was a little boy in Huntersville, North Carolina, who could not make his daddy proud. Eddie Lee Long was born on the 12th of May in 1953. His father was the Reverend Floyd Long, Jr., a Baptist minister who carried the weight of the pulpit into the kitchen and the bedroom of his own son. Imagine growing up under a man who preached love to strangers on Sunday and could not give it freely to his own child at home. That kind of wound does not stay buried. It grows roots. After studying business at North Carolina Central University, he took a job as a sales representative for Ford Motor Company, selling cars, charming people, learning the rhythm of persuasion. Then he enrolled at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. He wanted the pulpit. He wanted the authority his father wore so casually. What almost no one in his megachurch ever knew is that Eddie Long had been married before he stood in front of his beloved Vanessa. He married a woman named Deborah Houston in 1981. The marriage ended 4 years later, and the paperwork that came out of that divorce was sealed in a Fulton County courthouse until reporters from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution dug it up nearly 30 years later. In a counterclaim filed during the divorce proceedings, Deborah alleged that Eddie had a violent and vicious temper, and she stated that he beat her with his fists when she was 7.5 months pregnant. She said she and her son had to flee the family home in Fairburn to ensure their safety. Long's attorney Craig Gillen would later call those allegations absolutely not true. The son from that first marriage, Edward Long, grew up to work as the youth director at New Birth. That is a sentence worth reading twice, because the bitter irony of where this story is heading lands harder when you understand who was watching from inside the building. By the time Eddie Long walked into New Birth in 1987, he was a 33-year-old preacher with a hidden past and a hunger to build something so big that no one could ever look down on him again. And that hunger was about to find its perfect feeding ground: the spiritual daddy. The church he inherited had only 300 members and was quietly dying in Lithonia. Within a few short years, Eddie Long would turn it into one of the largest congregations in America, and he would do it by becoming something his father never was: a daddy. He preached the prosperity gospel with the body of a heavyweight boxer. He wore shirts that hugged his chest in a way that made grown women fan themselves in the front row. He stacked gold chains over his collar and flashed a Rolex when he raised his hand to bless the offering. He told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2005 that they were not just a church, but an international corporation. And he bragged that he dealt with the White House, with Tony Blair, with presidents around the world. The growth was staggering. 25,000 members, 240 acres of land. A $50 million cathedral built to hold 10,000 worshipers in a single service. But here is the line he gave that still chills me when I read it back. He boasted that mothers brought their grown sons to him for paddling. He said when he told them to bend over, even on a Sunday, they would bend over. He said it was because they respected him. He said it was because he first died for them. You hear that? And you understand the gospel he was selling. It was not Jesus on the cross. It was Eddie in the pulpit, and his body was the proof of the doctrine. He held the funeral for Coretta Scott King in 2006. 4 American presidents sat in his sanctuary that day. His ministry received a $1 million federal grant under George W. Bush's faith-based initiative. In December of 2004, he led roughly 10,000 people on a march from the King Center toward Turner Field in support of a state ban on same-sex marriage. The Southern Poverty Law Center labeled him as one of the most virulently homophobic black leaders in the country. He used that authority to build a program for fatherless boys. He called it the Longfellows Youth Academy. He pulled in young men who had no daddies at home and offered to be the daddy they had been praying for. 4 of those boys were about to walk into a lawyer's office and tell a story that would crack the foundation of the entire kingdom. The 5 rocks that were never thrown. In September of 2010, the lawsuits started landing one after the other like dominoes. Nobody could stop. Maurice Robinson was 20 years old, Anthony Flagg was 21, Jamal Paris was 23, Spencer LeGrand was 22. They filed in DeKalb County, and the language inside the complaints was specific enough to make your stomach drop. They alleged that Bishop Eddie Long used his spiritual authority to coerce them into relationships that began when they were teenagers. Jamal Paris said he was 14 years old when he first met the bishop, and Long told him to call him Daddy. Spencer LeGrand said he was 15 when he met the bishop in Charlotte after a sermon about fathers. Long looked him in the eye and said, "I got you. I will be your dad." The boys called this the spiritual son designation, and it came with everything a fatherless kid could ever want. Cars, jewelry, designer clothes, electronics, apartments, tuition checks, and salaries on the church payroll. Paris later described the way Long would alienate them from everyone else in their lives. He would tell them they were not allowed to talk to females. He would let everyone in their old lives believe they had abandoned their families. There was a ceremony that the boys described that I still cannot wrap my head around. Candles were lit, jewelry was exchanged, vows were said, scripture was read while the candles burned all the way down. Attorney B.J. Bernstein, who represented all 4 young men, described it in plain English. She said it was essentially a marriage ceremony. The trips read like a travel magazine: Kenya, South Africa, Honduras, the Bahamas, Trinidad, New Zealand. LeGrand said that when he was 17 years old, in a hotel room in Nairobi, jet-lagged and exhausted, the bishop urged him to take a sleep aid, and what followed that night was kissing and rubbing that he never asked for. Then Bernstein released the photos. Bishop Eddie Long is posing in what looks like a bathroom in a tight red muscle shirt. The picture had been sent from his BlackBerry in November of 2008. Signed, Eddie L. Long, amazed by his grace. Bernstein looked at the cameras and asked a question that should never have needed asking. She said, what pastor in his right mind sends a picture of himself posing in his bathroom in a muscle shirt? A 5th young man named Santino Kemp never sued, but he joined the settlement. He had Long's name tattooed on his wrist. The interview Jamal Paris gave to Fox 5 is one of the heaviest pieces of testimony I have ever watched. He looked into that camera and said that a man cannot look him in his eye and tell him that they did not live this pain. He said, "You are not a man, you are a monster." He said he could not get the sound of the bishop's voice out of his head, and he could not take enough showers to get the smell of that man off his body. On the 26th of September in 2010, Bishop Eddie Long stood in his pulpit and delivered the line that the internet will remember forever. He said he felt like David against Goliath, but he had 5 rocks, and he had not thrown a single one yet. The sanctuary stood up and applauded. He never threw a single rock. By May of 2011, he had quietly paid, and what he bought with that money was a silence that would slowly suffocate him for the next 6 years. Follow the paper trail. This is where the mansion stops being a building and starts being a clue. Because the same year Eddie Long was settling those lawsuits, reporters were already tracing a paper trail that would expose how the fortress on Hunt Valley Drive came to exist in the first place. In 1997, the church gifted land to a charity called Bishop Eddie Long Ministries. In 1998, that charity used a $1.16 million mortgage to purchase the property. On Christmas Eve of 2003, in a self-dealing move that should have raised every red flag in the building, the property was transferred out of the charity and directly into Eddie Long's personal name. The same day, a $300,000 loan was taken against it. 3 more mortgages would follow. Then, in 2006, the property was quietly deeded back to the church. Eddie Long once testified under oath that basically Bishop Eddie Long Ministries was Bishop Eddie Long. Read that quote again. He admitted in plain language that the charity and the man were one and the same. WSB-TV's Jody Fleischer found that the church had paid roughly $200,000 in property taxes on the bishop's house and nearly $85,000 on his private jet. Between 1997 and 2000, the charity gave Eddie Long more than $3 million in salary, benefits, and property. Senator Chuck Grassley opened a Senate Finance Committee investigation into 6 televangelists, and Eddie Long was one of them. But the deepest betrayal was still ahead, and it had nothing to do with the boys. Eddie Long stood in his pulpit and introduced a young man named Ephraim Taylor to his entire congregation. He called Taylor his friend, his brother, the great Ephraim Taylor. He told his members that everything Ephraim said was based on the Word of God. There was an internal memo inside New Birth that warned the church that Taylor intended to take advantage of the members. The introduction happened anyway. More than a dozen church members lost over $1 million in what turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. Ephraim Taylor was sentenced in March of 2015 to 19 years and 7 months in federal prison. By the time the lawsuits were paid and the Senate had finished asking questions, the body that Eddie Long had used as a billboard for God's favor began to do something that no doctrine could explain. It began to disappear. The Vanishing Man. In August of 2016, a video surfaced online of Bishop Eddie Long doing curls in a gym, and the man in the frame did not look like the bishop anybody remembered. He was gaunt. He was hollow. The muscles he had built his whole sermon style around were gone. He told his congregation that he was on a raw vegan diet and that he had rejected what he called the slave menu. He said he was going to live to be 100 years old. A month later, the story changed. A church spokesman finally admitted there was a health challenge. By December services, Eddie Long was completely bald and visibly frail. He stood in front of his people and told them he was ignoring their calls because everybody wanted to ask questions, and he did not want to rehearse facts. The gospel singer Kim Burrell publicly tied his decline to the scandal. She said nobody would be saying that you have AIDS unless a homosexual man had come out and revealed what you did behind closed doors. The rumor took on a life of its own. Bishop Eddie Long died on the 15th of January in 2017. He was 63 years old. The church issued a statement that said only that he had succumbed after a gallant private fight with an aggressive form of cancer. He never publicly answered the conspiracy theories. His funeral lasted 6 hours on the 25th of January in 2017. Deion Sanders broke down in tears and said this was a father figure to him, and he told the crowd that perhaps they were wrong about this man. Eddie Long was laid out in an off-white robe with a gold cross and rings on his fingers. His daughter Taylor wrote that she loved him and thanked him for being perfect. And when the cameras packed up and the parking lot emptied out, the real question started to surface. Within months, that question had a federal answer. What the fortress really hid. So we land back where this whole story began, standing at the gates of the mansion on Hunt Valley Drive, asking what was actually hidden inside. And I want to be honest with you, because the answer is not what the internet rumors promised. There was no secret room full of gold. There was no buried chest of cash dug up by surprised family members. What was hidden inside that mansion was something far more devastating. It was a doctrine. The IRS lien was just the receipt. The mansion itself, according to the property records, had been deeded back to New Birth in 2006. The bishop did not even legally own the home where he died, because the church and the man had blurred into one entity so completely that nobody could tell where the pulpit ended and the personal property began. The succession at New Birth fell apart almost as fast as the doctrine. Bishop Stephen Davis took over after Eddie Long's death. He served without a salary for his entire tenure, and he personally gave the church a significant sum of his own money to keep the lights on. He resigned after 16 months and later said publicly that corrupt leaders and wicked men had forced him out. Edward Long, the bishop's own son from his first marriage, was passed over twice for the senior pastor role. In December of 2018, the position went to a controversial Baltimore pastor named Jamal Harrison Bryant. He inherited the $31 million debt and promised the congregation a rebirth. The widow Vanessa lived a story of her own. She had filed for divorce in December of 2010 in the middle of the scandal, and she withdrew the petition within roughly 24 hours under the weight of church public relations. She would eventually dismiss it entirely in February of 2012. She told a women's ministry conference that year that she had chosen to return to her marriage. The fortress is still standing on Hunt Valley Drive. The gates are still there. The Bentley is gone. The bishop is gone. The empire is half the size it used to be. And the doctrine that built the whole thing is still being unraveled by every megachurch scandal that has come after it. The shadow Eddie Long cast was longer than any of us realized while he was alive. What was hidden inside Bishop Eddie Long's mansion was never a thing. It was a system. It was a doctrine that took the longing of fatherless boys and turned it into currency. It was a paper trail that bent the rules of charity law until they snapped. If this story moved you in any way, share your honest thoughts in the comments below and tell me which part hit you the hardest.